Fellow armchair Imagineers, Tiki here.
And Blue Dragon 5.
And tonight we're here to record a retrospective on the career of a man who we just recently lost, a man who very is very much understated in the world of comics, but very much a huge influence to basically the whole genre as a whole. Steve Ditko. What can you say about Ditko? Like, he was the creator of essentially at least the imagery of Spider-Man. He kind of pushed the boundaries of the comic art form with Doctor Strange. He had a very fascinating kind of moral compass sense of right and wrong. He This guy is an enigma, Dragon. He really is. I'm sure, of course, that we're going to be referencing the documentary a lot. I'll put a link in the description to the documentary. It's so eerie, Dragon. Like, watching that documentary has a lot of weird things. Like, of course, one of the many being frickin' Alan Moore in a suit. You know, well spoken for, well groomed Alan Moore. But the weirdest thing about that documentary for me, Dragon, is that it feels like a tribute to Steve Ditko, like 11 years before his death.
Yeah, from what I heard, it came out like a year before the MCU. I heard it was filmed in 2007, which is just so trippy.
You know, it's so weird. Like, I'm sorry, folks. I don't mean to trivialize this.
Yeah, I think we're kind of burying the important lead here, but
Yeah, Dragon, you're so much better at introductions than I am. Why don't I pass the verbal baton?
let me take a stab at it here. Folks, we lost another hero, and unfortunately, um, he's not coming back. Sorry, this year, folks, we've lost so many heroes in the figurative sense and the literal sense, and unfortunately, he's not coming back like we'd imagine. A number of them will be coming back in 2019. This is but while he's not coming back, his work will live on. Steve Ditko has passed, artist, creator, plotter extraordinaire, famously self-exiled, he's famously a self-exiled and private man in the rise of the superhero film, especially. I mean, as Marvel just kept getting bigger and bigger, the guy he never wanted for more. He just, well, as far as we know, he never wanted for more. He reportedly he passed June 27th, and he was found June 29th. I say found in a regretful sense. It's always a shame when that happens, folks. I feel I'm going to go full circle with this little thing here. We're going to get to this when we get to the end of this here, but I think it's a shame that Steve Ditko, from what we know, we don't know much about this guy, but he didn't. He went on his own terms. It seems to me. It seems that Steve Ditko is a guy who kind of went out on his own terms. He lived a solitary life. He kind of, he lived alone. He was very, just kind of very. I don't say single-minded in a negative context, but he was a guy who he he just did the job. It's like kind of like how we love in character in our fictional characters like our Mike Ehrmantrauts. They're just like guys who get the job done. They're very just mind focused, and there's like they're not looking for praise. They're not looking to stick around. They just do the job because that's what it was. And I tell you, there was always this documentary in search of Steve Ditko, and I think if once I perused it, and I'll get into if you don't mind, I'll transition here to
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
the significance of it. So, the overall, folks, Steve Ditko is a name I think we all recognize. It was always for me. It was always a name that stuck out when you're reading Spider-Man. It's like Steve Ditko. Ditko is a cool name, just as is, and I've heard him mentioned in Stanley interviews because that's the thing. Stanley, opposed to certain DC creators, let's say, Stanley always referenced and he always name dropped all the great co-creators that he'd come across, like the artists that have birthed the concepts that he came up with, and just basically brought them to life. And of course, the famous Marvel method. Like, Stanley always gave him credit where credit was due, as much as he could. And Steve Ditko is a name that always talked up by the creators. Whenever you hear Spider-Man, more often than not, you're going to hear Steve Ditko followed along with Stanley right after Spider-Man. And there was a documentary put out called "In Search of Steve Ditko," which I recommend everybody check out. And I had this. I really came across this, and I came across kind of Steve Ditko, the man, when not personally, unfortunately, but I came across him when I was Stan Lee came to my Comic Con one year. It was the first year I was going to meet Stan Lee. When I did, is I created a little humble piece of fan art for him. I drew Stan in the middle, and I drew some other kind of creators, and kind of like Joan Lee. I put them all on like this little like a comic cover almost.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve Ditko I put on there, and this is where this is where I is kind of becoming aware of, okay, well, of course Steve Ditko has to be on there, because when you think you got had Jack Kirby on there, had John Romita Sr., and you get Steve Ditko, and of course, having known the name, I never had to look into the guy before, so I look into the guy, and there's like, you're looking for good reference material, and the odd thing that kind of started to dawn on me as I was kind of doing research on the guy is that, hey, there's only like there's like 2 photographs of Steve Ditko ever, and everything else is
so it's a much more flattering version of the Mike Ellis situation that we ran into with Channel Awesome.
Essentially, yes, it's a more flattering version. At least we had artistic renderings by Ditko himself. Like Ditko had caricatured himself in comics. So this I had an approximation of Steve Ditko. That kind of opened my eyes to, and I looked in search of Steve Ditko. I had skipped around the first time just to see, like, again, having not watched it all the way through, and I regret that now. But just having seen, okay, do they actually meet the guy? This whole in search of Steve Ditko, and it's yes and no, and we'll get into that a little later. There was kind of a yes and no with that, and the point is, Steve Ditko is just he's just kind of this Tiki hit it right on the head. He's an enigma of a guy. It was this enigmatic discovery that, oh man, something's really interesting about Steve Ditko. The guy's just not in the limelight.
That's like a very much like a hardcore, like right and wrong conflict. Like either you're good or you're bad. But at the same time, Dragon, he was responsible for some of the most iconic counterculture characters ever. Like that's kind of like an enigma in itself. You know what I mean? That's kind of like a bizarre kind of like oxymoron of a life.
Most certainly. Like, do you have any particular Ditko memories in your case here? You got anything that?
Honestly, outside of like the shy Steve Ditko thought bubbles, when he would be referenced in the comics, not a ton. And I gotta say, Dragon, this is one of those guys where I didn't even really know if he was alive or not. I hate to say that, but so in terms of like taking the news of his passing, it wasn't really something that hit me like, like hard, but it was like, it was kind of like more so a good chance for me to jump into the exploration of him as a figure. And of course, Dragon, I think you and I can both agree, probably the biggest fan we know of this guy personally is Jacob Gulliver, who's a huge fan of Doctor Strange and all the imagery and art that Doctor Strange represents. And Jacob Gulliver would happily just give us a whole course study on Steve Ditko's influence on Doctor Strange. So Dragon, I definitely feel for people like Gulliver and people like, as batshit crazy as he is these days, people like Alan Moore who cut their teeth on Steve Ditko and who really live and breathe Steve Ditko's style.
Yeah, and actually, folks, I'm going to blow Tiki's mind with some of like kind of the legacy of what Steve Ditko was kind of in part responsible for, with his long, Steve Ditko had a very interesting life. Again, we don't know much about the guy himself, but we know about the work that he's done. That's kind of the approximation we have of the guy. And again, like the only real glimpse of the guy that can really be discerned was that BBC documentary In Search of Steve Ditko. And I recommend to everybody, because essentially we're going to. It is kind of a good roadmap, but again, there are other things of like Steve Ditko. He's. I'm not trying to just keep recycling enigmatic, but that's just such a perfect word for the guy. Is that he is very Steve Ditko. He kind of became his characters in a very interesting respect. He at least became his most interesting characters. There are 3 that come to mind that really embodied kind of who Ditko was, and it's kind of that sort of like it's the like when you have a family, like you become your family members, and I think it's kind of you become your creation becomes you. It's kind of the son becomes the father becomes the son effect, and I think Ditko had that with his work. The guy was kind of ethically he was kind of in the superhero mindset in many regards. Of course, a very kind of very not a superhero that would allow for a lot of moral gray, but definitely someone who kind of this is the guy you would want drawing your comics. I think this is the simplest way to put
Oh yeah.
simplest way to put Steve Ditko. So again, I'm going to blow Tiggy's mind with a few like fun Ditko facts as we go throughout this thing. But yeah, I guess we're just going to go chronologically through the man's very amazing life. Again, to pay tribute like, in the little ways we can, folks. I mean, the wondrous life that Ditko had and the impact that he's had on the landscape of comics. I mean, I would say he's kind of the visual X. He's one of the, he along with Jack Kirby are the visual X factor of Marvel Comics. Without these two artists, you don't have Marvel Comics. And I'd say Jack Kirby was kind of the if Jack Kirby were the bricks of Marvel, then Steve Ditko was the cement. Like his nickname was Sturdy Steve Ditko for a reason. Sturdy Steve Ditko or Shy Steve Ditko. And I remember I was doing like I had like all the nicknames like Jazzy John Romita and yeah, I think I went with Sturdy Steve Ditko. And because again, it's like that's kind of like the guy was sturdy, the guy was solid, the guy knew what he was doing, and he and Kirby adhered to the Marvel method, so they were absolutely kind of the lifeblood of the industry, and they really kind of, along with Stan Lee, again, Stan Lee has said it many times before, he's a dedicated word balloon guy. He loves just adding it. He loves like taking like some of the best art in comics and just kind of giving it, giving it good verbose dialogue. He just loves kind of making it into a comic strip, basically taking masterworks of art and sequential storytelling and bringing it to life and bringing it to this. Basically turning it from a work of art into a story, into a page,
Mm-hmm.
So, let's go to the beginning with Steve Ditko then.
All right, so he was mentored by none other than the creator of the Joker himself, Jerry Robinson. Dragon, I feel like there's a kind of a weird, uh, kind of bookendish nature to his career where he's mentored by a guy who's very famous for creating, of course, probably the iconic superhero villain. And then by the same time, there's this whole thing that's going to kind of like haunt his life of the co-creatorship of Spider-Man and Stan Lee kind of like, being as gracious as he can about it, but still Stan Lee kind of having that clash of ideologies about him with that. So I don't know, I just find that very interesting that from the get-go, the whole idea of creating characters and ownership of characters was very prevalent with him. Not much else to say about the Jerry Robinson stuff.
It is, and also just a little fun fact. He many comic creators, especially like guys like Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, they had enlisted in the war effort. Even Stan Lee himself there, and like Stan Lee, they had they wanted to serve their country, kind of like their inner Captain Americas, if you will. And they and in Steve Ditko's case, he helped in the post-war effort, which you don't really see every day. He helped in the post-war effort, and he worked in the army newspaper. So, a little fun fact. And I think we mentioned this with Bud Lucky of all people too. Bud Lucky, he I believe using the same GI Bill, using basically it was kind of like a the ultimate recommendation for a job. Essentially, that's kind of what the GI Bill was for the kids out there. Essentially, this worked to Ditko's advantage. It got him to work with one of his idols because Ditko, growing up, as we mentioned, he was, and this I just loved how this surprised me so much going through this here. Like I had no idea that Ditko was a Bat fan growing up, but it kind of makes sense because if you're getting in the comics, you're gonna be reading some comics and. DC. I mean, it's so funny. Every decade in comics kind of switches off between which comic company owned the decade. And many a time it's kind of between DC and Marvel, and DC definitely had the bases loaded in the beginning, up front there.
Mm-hmm.
Where you had Batman, you had Will Eisner's The Spirit. I forget if that was directly. I know DC eventually had The Spirit. I'm just trying to think if that was Will Eisner working with DC or if it was like kind of a separate company of that, because that's also something that's going to be in Ditko's life too, kind of separate comic companies being absorbed into the big two. So that's kind of another recurrent theme. But I think it's very interesting what you point out there, because Robinson is absolutely indicative of kind of the whole of the Bob Kane thing with basically the famous Bill Finger injustice that happened, and other creators. Basically, Bob Kane. Look, I'll defend Bob Kane to a point, but by the same token, it was an unfair thing that happened to the comic creators that worked on Batman in the early days. Specifically, Bill Finger. Now, again, I'm not going to say Ditko and Bill Finger were necessarily in the same group because it's a very different story for those two guys, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Robinson basically he came up with the playing card. Basically, he came up with the idea for the Joker with the whole playing card. Like you just say, hey, he drew the Joker playing card and it's like, let's do this as a character, and then Bill Finger kind of came up with the characterization, and then of course Bob Kane he did the art for it. He just kind of extrapolated off of Jerry Robinson. Then Jerry Robinson, for the majority of it, he did the art, and Bob Kane took the credit for the art. Hence being a ghost artist. Like, hey, is there someone? It's like the elves making the shoes. It was there overnight. So yes, Ditko was a Bat fan, and you'll notice a detective vibe because, of course, later on when Ditko eventually works for DC or kind of Charlton to eventually DC, those are really big detective characters. So I'd imagine the Batman stories had a big impact on them, and of course the design of the Spirit is of course going to be a huge influence on later on, just your classic blue trench coat and hat and everything.
Oh yeah.
So he trained in art school by the great Jerry Robinson. He's very dedicated to his craft and basically all this hard work. Again, he's a very hard worker, very much kind of a Peter Parker of his time. This led him to become an inker at Marvel. And now we're going to fast forward. That's roughly from 1945 to the 1950s, like I think 57. So now let's fast forward to 1962.
Yeah, so this is of course the creation of Spider-Man. And this is like a really interesting debate, Dragon. Like Stan Lee, of course, he always has in the interviews, he's like, well, one day I was looking at a spider and he was crawling up the wall. And I was like, what if you could apply that to a superhero? But Dragon, I gotta say, it was really striking to me, like when the documentary pointed out just how impactful the design of Spider-Man is. I got to admit, like when I was a little kid, yeah, yeah, big time, big time. That's why seeing live action Spider-Man was so impactful for me, Dragon, and that's something that's we really need to drive home. Um, the fact that like up until that point, these superhero costumes were sort of like very primary canvas colors, capes. And Spider-Man was basically the Edna Mode of his generation. He came along, he was like, no capes. And what I love about Spider-Man, though, Dragon, is all the detail that goes into his design. Spider-Man is such a fun character. Like, Dragon, I'm by no means like I'm sure, like, I've not seen your fan art, but I'm sure you do enough of it. I'm sure you're Da Vinci compared to me. But I gotta say, Spider-Man is just a fun character just to draw, just for fun. Because there's so many like little patterns and oodles on his costume. It's just kind of like you can just I basically, Dragon, what I'm trying to say is I had like countless notebooks in high school were filled with Spider-Man drawings in the margins, just because I was like, all right, like I don't know, there's just something very aesthetically pleasing about it. I think that's going to run its way through Ditko's work. Like Ditko is going to have like a very, like I said, again, it's a very kind of weird just juxtaposition between this hardcore staunch edge to him in terms of the conservatism, while at the same time his artistry is very much just surreal and leaps off the page and just striking.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, it was the first full face masked character in Marvel Comics. I won't say in comics period because I think the Justice League back in the early days, you had Hour Man. I think, he had I think he may have been the first the first full face mask in comics. I think I could be absolutely wrong on that. I'm not sure. It might be Sandman or the early Sandman, not the not the Neil Gaiman.
Weird to see that Sandman with a face mask.
But technically, again, that Sandman's inspired by the original Sandman, though, so they are technically connected. But my point is, so again, at least for Marvel, was the first kind of like full face mask character, which again adds this great universal quality to anybody could be under the mask. And again, I'm absolutely with you, Teague. Of course, we all remember that famous story, and so Stan Lee did come up with the initial concept of Spider-Man. He's an insect-based teenage superhero. That's what he came up with. It was It was basically the bug theme, which he landed on Spider, and the fact that he basically pitched like, hey, what about we do like instead of a teenage sidekick, because that's like sounds like such a bad idea, let's make a teenage superhero. Like, Stan, don't you know anything? Martin Goodman, I think, is like, telling him, Stan, do you even know what a hero is? You can't have a teenager as a hero with problems. So again, Stanley had like the Parker luck in place there, but the visuals weren't quite coming together for him. So he goes to the Jack Kirby. And he basically, now here's like a new kind of a spoke in the wheel I didn't know about. The creation of Spider-Man, which really interested me. That really kind of blew my mind here. So of course, famously, we know he goes to Jack Kirby, and Jack Kirby did sketches of basically a Captain America styled Spider-Man. Now again, when that was said to me all these years, Tiki, I just imagine, okay, it's like basically it's the Spider. You imagine it's the Spider-Man costume, but just like with a Captain America figure underneath. You imagine that, but I was then reminded as I kind of found this out, and it all clicked for me, that it's like when Jack Kirby designed Black Panther, he didn't start off as like the Black Panther we all know and love. It was like the Cold Tiger. The initial prototype of Black Panther was like there was no mask, and he was wearing like gray and red and green colors, and it wasn't at all Black Panther. So with that, what I've heard described is that it was a Spider-Man who, again, it was a guy with a spider theme. I don't know exactly what he looked like, but I know this, according to what I found. He had like a spider web gun. Like that's how he did the web slinging. It wasn't a wrist. There was no wrist. From what I've read,
would have been like a never-ending grappling hook.
Essentially, yes. I mean, don't know. I love me a grappling gun, but I mean, at the time, it was kind of very derivative of Batman. It was just very derivative of kind of like espionage and Batman. Compared to what we all know and love about Spider-Man, the tech of Spider-Man, and also he had like a spider ring, which I don't know if that meant that it allowed him to wall crawl. Basically, again, they were kind of ripping off Green Lantern and Batman with the whole like he put on a ring and he either had the costume underneath or allowed him like to crawl like a spider. One of the two.
Oh.
So again, really bizarre. So then he gives it to Steve Ditko, again, kind of a guy who's kind of, I would imagine, kind of starting out in the industry. I mean, he's probably he had done odd and end stories, kind of like Marvel before the superhero craze. They were doing like monster stories, so I imagine Ditko probably got his bones doing some monster stories on the side. So for all I know, he could have been one of the regular artists on the Amazing Fantasy book that eventually, of course, becomes Amazing Fantasy 15. So he devises that iconic look, and basically, the simple way of putting it, he came up with all the stuff in regards to Spider-Man, the hero. I think Stan Lee came up with all the Peter Parker, all the groundwork of the character, and he has to pitch him the stuff, and then Ditko visualizes. I would equate it to Stan Lee's the father, where Ditko's the very important mother, where like he birthed the concept into existence, and that's something not to take lightly. Stan Lee just had he kind of put the ball into play. But Ditko is dribbling it and he makes the basket. That's kind of what he's doing there.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, again, I think they also have strategy in play there with like Stan Lee, but again, it's all relative here. We have the universal mask, you get the eyes. He famously, Ditko had the eyes that could change shape, which we now have in the MCU with after all these years since Civil War. We have like the emoting Spider-Man eyes. That was Ditko's signature. Were the emoting Spider-Man eyes. Of course, they have the wall crawling, and by proxy of the wall crawling, Ditko's signature was iconic posing like no one else had done in comics. Tiki, it was his body could contort. He looked like a teenager, not a full-grown man. And famously, something's going to bleed into Doctor Strange when we get to it. Ditko hands, like all like the hand shapes, the very the loves, the kind of the sign language love symbol that is the Spider-Man thwip. It's the web slinging pose. That's all Ditko magic right there. And what he really sold in the art too, I feel, is just he really made it feel like a kid who was in over his head. And again, as I said, like he's all thin and wispy, and he's again, visually it fed into what Ditko was laying out with the story, where again they just complement each other. So these guys were very diametrically opposite of each other in personality and tone and everything. Lee was an older guy, and Ditko, it was just from all not by much. I'll give it that. I'm sorry. I think Stanley always seems like he was the young buck back in the early days. I keep forgetting that because again he always had the. I keep thinking of that one radio image they keep playing of it. He has like this fedora and everything on. He just looks a little older than he does. But the point is, these are guys just philosophically very diametrically opposed, and like one's a kind of a shun, and again, one very much is Peter Parker, where the other one is J. Jonah Jameson. That's kind of what their dynamic is. So, so yeah, he really just sold like with the expression work, and you saw like a kid who was like unsure of himself, and who in the heat of battle you could buy like he's jumping around, flailing around, and he might be in mortal danger, and he really sold that. And you gotta remember, Amazing Fantasy 15. That's 11 page. That's an 11-page story in two parts. It's like part one's he gets the powers. Part two is the big morality of it all. It's the big, it's the great power, great responsibility section, and it's all 11 pages. I mean, it sounds like it's like 11 pages. I mean, come on though, guys. That's. I know we did Batman's origin.
It's not Shakespeare, but at the same point, it's like it's pretty much as close to Shakespeare as we have in modern comic book storytelling.
I gotta tell you, I like it a lot better than Shakespeare. I gotta tell you, I'm nothing against Shakespeare. I'm just saying, come on, we're talking like rarely do.
Your pull is even coming from Dragon. I'm sorry.
I'm just saying, like, how can you compare Shakespeare to the beautiful line? With great power, there must also come great responsibility. Like, oh my golly, that just like put that on a mug right there. It's perfect.
Yeah,
a very philosopher in the world put that on a mug. So let's see. So again, we kind of have the powers and then the morality really coming through with those stories, and then of course, as I mentioned before, the Marvel method really defined their relationship as well, where Ditko essentially plotted the stories, and if you basically like Jack Kirby, you basically you're Stanley, almost like Kevin, as we've kind of joked with the revelation that Kevin Feige in the MCU, he will pop into the writers' room and he'll just like say, "Okay, guys, big revelation, we get Spider-Man now," and he'll exit the room just very nonchalantly, and that's coming from Marcus and McFreely, the Captain America writers who also wrote Infinity War. It's coming from the source, folks. We're not making that up. I swear to God, we're not making that up. For a change, it sounds like something we'd make up, but it is not. I swear to you.
You're right. It does sound like one of our little tangents we'd go on.
No. But essentially, Stan would walk in with for almost a meeting, and he'd basically say, "Okay, I want to do a character like this," and then they'd come up with they'd flesh out the character, they'd visualize it. Stan might kind of come up with like the name or so, and maybe a few details, but for the most part, the artist would run with it, and that's the Marvel method. He would then add the dialogue balloons after these beautiful pages of art. And story came in, like an action sequence would be there, and he like add like a oof, but not just much more than that, like Spider-Man quipping along the way. That's all. That was their method. Like famously, Lee and Ditko, they hardly spoke to each other because they worked together so well in that regard. Of like they didn't need to talk to each other. That's kind of a testament to how well they worked together. They never had to say a word to each other aside from, "Okay, Vulture, old man that flies, go with it." And Ditko, "Okay, flying action scene." It's all came together.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. So Ditko did Spider-Man for 40 issues. In those 40 issues, Tiki, imagine this. We get all these. Basically, we get the basic, the Spider-Man 101 in those 40 issues. We get the Sinister Six. We get the Green Goblin. We get the Lizard. We get the Scorpion. We get all the classic Spider-Man villains in those 40 issues. That's really big. It's Ditko kind of figuring out the landscape there.
And Dragon, I know those 40 issues really well because I had the Essentials collections.
Oh, yeah, and of course, issue 50 is like that's in the John Romita Jr. I'm sorry, John Romita Sr. Vein. Of course, that's when the Kingpin gets introduced, and that's Spider-Man No More. So I love issue 50, but still, within those 40 issues, issue number 33. That's the famous Spider-Man trapped under like the iron fixtures. He's just trapped under the machinery, and gets into a fight. Famously, and we finally saw this kind of adapted in for the most part, at least referenced lovingly.
I still think if you're gonna adapt it, you have to have like the stakes of someone like outside of the situation involved to make it really powerful. Like have it not just be a fight for your life, but like if you die, someone else will die too.
Sure, but there was a responsibility to still stop the bad guy, so that was still kind of still kind of on.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. It's the Aunt May side of things is always what makes that storyline so emotional for me personally. So
For
like,
those who may have forgotten,
I don't
essentially,
look. Let's kind of like pump the brakes on it. I don't want to get into a homecoming debate.
well, the point is just for the recap. That's specifically that story. So Aunt May was sick, and Peter was Peter was really off his game, and it was a 3-part story, from 31 to 33. And Aunt May got sick in issue 31, and Spider-Man and Peter Parker, even in his dual identity, was really ticked off and panicking. He didn't know what to do because he had to raise money to get like an experimental treatment, an isotope, and he had the he was Spider-Man was going up against these bad guys, and again, all this on his plate while he's trying to save Aunt May. And as he's getting into a fight with Doc Ock, and Doc Ock's saying, "Oh my God, Spider-Man, he's really ticked off. I gotta get out of here." As that happens, Spider-Man's trapped in this machinery. He's given time to cool down, reflect on things, and the guilt about Uncle Ben, all the loved ones, and that's where he finds the inner strength. And we have this epic, iconic page in the Tomes of Spider-Man here, where he's just trapped in this machinery. The water is pouring on his head. He's just in such a dire, desperate situation. It'll flood, it'll kill him, but he's not even thinking about himself. And he finds the strength and he rises it. He's then, yeah.
Yep.
I guess on the whole for Spider-Man with Ditko, he was.
I'm sorry, Dragon. If I sound bored, I'm not bored. I'm just I had a very, very, very long day at work, and I'm very tired. So we're recording this late at night, folks. So Dragon's kind of doing most of the heavy lifting for me, unfortunately.
I'm under the machine with all the water pouring on me now. It's gonna lift, lift. but yeah, Ditko, he was a shy, quiet type, like Peter Parker, and he had again, like Peter Parker, he had a sense of responsibility and duty to doing the job. It was the right thing to do, therefore he did it, and it was the thing that Ditko kind of could do best. And it's almost like kind of what we're doing now with Spider-Man, where if you have a responsibility. If you can do something, you should do it. And yeah, again, that's what I'm saying, folks. He didn't need the thanks. He didn't need the praise. He just loved comics. Again, he just grew up loving comics and this character. He was enamored with this character, and that's kind of what kind of drives a rift and what kind of possibly kind of gets him out of things later on. It's kind of a poetic. Again, it's ambiguous, but if it's the case, it's quite poetic. So speaking of poetic ironies, let's talk about Doctor Strange.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that I wish I had more firsthand experience in Dragon, because just hearing other people talk about it, it definitely seems like something that I'd be into. I think the really interesting thing about Doctor Strange is how it represents, kind of like the surrealist side of Ditko, kind of meshing with the the disciplined side of him. It's almost like the two sides of him being at war with each other in Doctor Strange. But I mean, just visually speaking, like Doctor Strange kind of pushed the boundaries. You know what it kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of what Disney. This is going to sound like a bizarre comparison, but it kind of reminds me of the sorts of things that I like from Disney, like when Disney is at their best in the surrealism department, things like pink elephants, things like
basically it's a Fantasia effect with Doctor Strange.
Pretty much. It's like the closest thing that comics have to the Fantasia quality to them, and I can't tell you how much I respect that, Dragon.
Yeah, Doctor Strange, from what I understand, Doctor Strange was specifically that was Ditko's babies, and Stanley, again, Stanley had the initial concept for Spider-Man. When it came to Doctor Strange, Ditko just he really felt there's a lot of artistic expression in Doctor Strange. He did the 6 pages, and it wasn't the origin story. That's like a lot of times in comics, the origin story comes later. Like even with Batman, we had. We didn't really. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking back to see Detective 27 when we had we didn't get Batman's origin until I think Detective 30. I think it was Detective Comics number 30, or maybe it was one of the Batman issues, whichever. We didn't get it till a little down the line. Again, the first going was like you have to establish these characters, and that's essentially what he did. We just had this neat and mystical guy in a cape. We start off though with the human side of the story, where the guy wakes up, he has a nightmare, and then he goes into the astral form, and then we see all this trippy psychedelic stuff. Oh my God! If you wake up, you have a nightmare, and you examine why you had that nightmare. Done all an all-in visual, and
I mean, it's very much kind of like the metaphysical, like I don't know, Dragon. I'm having a hard time trying to describe my analogy, but it's basically like for the trippy, like for the trippy. God damn it! It's like it's a great thesis statement in the same way that "There Goes Charlie Brown, How I Hate Him" is a great thesis statement. You know what I mean?
well, you know, Tiggy, it's interesting that you brought up Disney because it's just occurring to me now that there was I read somewhere there was a kind of there was a vague Salvatore Dali
Yes, yes, Destino.
influence, yes, and I'm saying with the whole Destino of it all, it's kind of got me thinking about Dali, and that was again that does fit with Doctor Strange's style with the kind of psychedelic surrealist nature of all. Just these bizarre out of left field concepts that somehow work. And bear in mind, folks, I was never really a magic guy, so I never got into Doctor Strange, but I did recognize Doctor Strange's place in the MCU where even like the John Romita Jr. stories years later, like Spider-Man would Doctor Strange is like the ultimate crossover character because he's the guy who people go to as if it were like you're seeing a fortune teller, you're seeing a psychic. He's like the doctor of the MCU when you have like if you can't go to the night nurse, you're going to Doctor Strange for like the bigger problems. And of course, the MCU had sold me on Doctor Strange more than I ever thought I would be in
Sure,
life.
sure.
So now Doctor Strange is definitely something to look back upon, and the reason for that. So basically, Ditko let loose with the psychedelic style, and he did thing. And this is where we get the quality of Ditko, where we had just kind of building a character from the ground up, Spider-Man, in terms of like visuals and iconography. And what we did with Doctor Strange is, in connection to that, we're doing more things broadly. We're doing more things that were not done in comics at the time. Like we're going like really big and really broad and really expressionistic with everything. It's like, oh my god, we're throwing something at a wall and seeing if it sticks. And it's the '60s, so everything sticks. That's kind of what we're doing there. And Stan Lee, he did three really important things with Doctor Strange. And I think it still goes a long way here, where he did what he classically does, spicing up the dialogue, adding all the big kind of magic mumbo jumbo, all the big, basically all the really cool names, like
Mhm.
all the magic stuff that Doctor Strange says, like the eye of Agamotto, the cloak of levitation, all that stuff. And made him a doctor, which is very important because before it was just like something like Mr. Strange or something, I think. So you called made him a doctor, which again did have a lot of mileage and eventually gets us that origin. And I think the important thing I think speaks to Lee and Ditko's dynamic is that Stan Lee he did back Ditko's creativity and he sold the concept essentially, saying you know what. Not our best. And folks, I'm just kind of I'm quoting what I read here, where it's like he basically said, "Look, not the best story, but I think we can go somewhere with this character. I just love the fact that he backed this character because he trusted Steve Ditko and he loved what he did on Spider-Man. Like, this guy's a good artist. He has a direction. Here's stuff that's not. Stan Lee always had forethought of like, let's do something that's not being done in comics, and of course, this visually is that. So let's do more of it. It's something. It's a different flavor. Like, why not? And Doctor Strange, along with like the Silver Surfer, are really popular at colleges at this time. Like you have all these blacklight posters of the Silver Surfer, and I would imagine some Doctor Strange stuff.
Oh yeah.
Ditko again, he very proudly plotted the 6-page story, and of course the ones that followed, and we have like the Ditko signatures here, like again the Ditko hands, as in all the course, when we get to the Doctor Strange movie, we have all like it's hands, 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 folks. It's nothing but hands. Hands
Well,
is
it's
the
funny
big
because
symbol.
we have the Doctor Strange movie, which is like hand symbolism, and then we have Infinity War, which is like the hand orgasm.
Well, yes,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to put it that way,
yeah.
but
It's kind of when you really when you put it
it's
that
like
way.
it's
There's
like
some
too many hands, hands everywhere, hands.
yes. We're not talking Harrison Ford. A lot of hands. But like all the posing of the hands and like the leopard print gloves and everything, like all the the gloves and everything, just all these great poses. Like I love it. Even now we do like when he activates the Eye of Agamotto, he does the great hand pose that I can't do, even though it should be relatively simple, but I can still never do it. Um, no, basically, again, he took like his Spider-Man, like in the thwip pose, and he just went crazy with it. And that's
Oh,
essentially what Doctor Strange is. It's taking kind of your okay, we got like superhero 101. Now we're just going to go really broad with it and just go see what sticks. And we get the areas like Eternity. So Eternity is something that we get a little cameo of in Guardians of the Galaxy. There's like there's this stone carving in the I believe in the temple that the Star Lord gets the orb from, the Power Stone from, and you see this carving of like all the entities, like Lady Death. Like Lady Death is technically there, but again, they weren't sure what they were doing at that point with that. So like Lady Death's there, Eternity I think is there. Like all these great cosmic and celestial beings are there. And Eternity, TQ, I don't know if you've ever seen Eternity. Eternity was the
I
big,
have no idea what you're talking about, unfortunately.
essentially, like Eternity was the concept of eternity, but personified into like a force, like a Galactus-sized person that Doctor Strange would combat. That I think contained Dormammu, or Dormammu would try to harness the power of Eternity, which is like a giant Galactus-shaped person. This is the trippy psychedelic nature of it, folks. It's like the silhouette of a person, like Peter Pan's shadow almost. Like a silhouette, and inside that silhouette, inside that outline, is like all of space and time and cosmos, and it's like the idea is this is all the parallel dimensions and all the things that Doctor Strange can see into, like in Infinity War, like he can see into all the possible.
Something from Kingdom Hearts, but I won't bore you with the details.
Well, you get what I'm saying. Yeah, Doctor Strange can see all the possible realities. Essentially, this is like the point of Genesis for all. This is how he can see in all those possible realities, I think. And I don't know for certain, folks. This is what I've heard. So, you get all that. You get Dormammu, which we saw realized in Doctor Strange. Like, yes, that's how you do like that big cosmic, Galactus type kind of Marvel right there. I'm loving that wheelhouse. Like Dormammu was a concept that always delayed me because it's just like the guy with a big flaming head, and we kind of got that in spades, and even better with Doctor Strange the movie.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so of course the big trademarks of Steve Ditko. You got Spider-Man, you got Doctor Strange. So in total, he had worked on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. He did a little bit of Iron Man, a little bit of the Incredible Hulk, but in the end, he left after 40 issues of Spider-Man. He left for unknown reasons, and people speculate to what those reasons are. I mean, they range from again, he and Lee were very opposite minds. Like politically, they were on opposite sides. Where Stan Lee would skew towards kind of like the kind of very left side of things, and Ditko be really right and sturdy and kind of strict, and like he would be.
Stan Lee would basically be like the like the cool uncle, like, oh, I'm on your side, kids, and then and then Steve Ditko is like the stern father figure.
You dirty, take a bath, you dirty hippies, essentially. Which is so trippy because I can imagine hippies would go crazy for Steve Ditko because of the Doctor Strange.
Oh, naturally.
So again, that's a theory, but the point is like they came from two different mindsets, and they would kind of clash over what the end dialogue balloons were of like, come on, Stan, you go, like, they really didn't converse that much, but I imagine Steve Ditko, whether he expressed this or not, we don't know, probably would say, "Do you really? Come on, let's not be so nice to to the hippies. Let's call them out on it." Of course, there's the whole co-creator business. Now, to summarize the co-creator business, essentially, again, it's not a Bill Finger situation, but famously, Jack Kirby
kind of like a snafu over like someone's definition of the term co-creator more than anything else.
Yeah, that's the thing. You got to remember, Tiki, is that the artists at Marvel they weren't shafted like Bill Finger was, but by the same token, like Stan Lee mentioned them all the time. They were like on like the whole Merry Marvel Marching Society. They were celebrated. Artists were celebrated. Unfortunately, monetarily, they were not. So artists were treated very like an artist like a dime a dozen. Essentially, that's how they were treated. But in reality, of course, they were worshipped by people reading the comics and not as valued as they are today. And that's the thing. Like Jack Kirby, like everyone would get credit on the books at Marvel, but by the same token, they might not get like the rights to the artwork that they made, or like they would not get paid equally, or they would not be mentioned. Basically, there'd be the general misconception that the writer was the all-encompassing creative force, and like Stan Lee, basically the misconceptions that Stan Lee, because he gets mentioned most, and Stan Lee was a very song and dance man. He was the cheerleader, he was the MVP for Marvel as a company. So people just associated Stan Lee with the character entirely, and like Jack Kirby understood that, but by the same token, it did hurt a little bit. And Steve Ditko, it was just the simple sticking point of he was he was a co-creator, but he saw himself as the creator, and that's when we get into the semantical debate, which I kind of err on Stan Lee's side, but I do respect that Stan Lee. The way it goes is that Stan Lee personally believes that Ditko is absolutely a co-creator, but the guy who came up with the initial concept, the guy who put his foot in the door, is the creator. And again, I don't think he's wrong so long as we still give credit to both guys, which again, he said he put in writing even for him. Like, look, I will tell everybody, I'll put in writing for you that I believe you co-created Spider-Man with me. And he's technically right, but it's like, I guess it's a question of who did more work in that case. Maybe it's Ditko, but by the same token, Stan Lee, he did all the character framework, so it's kind of hard to. It's Co is good, folks. Co is good, but unfortunately, people see Lee before they see Co.
Yeah.
So again, it's unsure if we're uncertain if that was like the big stick and play. That was the last straw, because again, Stan Lee was accommodating as he could be. It was just like a philosophy thing. He wouldn't budge from. That's how I feel about it, but he wouldn't be malicious about it, though, from what we understand. And then there's the whole Green Goblin secret identity thing. And I think everyone wants it to be the Green Goblin secret identity thing. I kind of just for the silliness of it all, I'd like it to be this. The idea is when they revealed who the Green Goblin was. Steve Ditko wanted it to be an unknown character because he thought it would be too convenient that it just happens to be a character that Spider-Man knew and had familiar. It had to be the Osborns. He's friends with either I forget who was the Green Goblin at the time of the reveal, but it has to be like an Osborn man, one of the men from the Osborn family. How convenient is that? Stan Lee said, "No, that's the drama. That's the Shakespearean drama. Well, his friend or his friend's father is the Green Goblin. That's paying off the seeds that we had planted."
Uh-huh.
They had disagreements on that, and again, on the whole, just Ditko was a very he didn't want to be in the limelight all over. Stan Lee absolutely wanted to be in the limelight. We have the famous record of the Merry Marvel Marching Society, where all the artists like John Romita Jr., Jack Kirby, they all make cameos on this thing, but I remember this from the Stan Lee document.
The back window.
I guess he is
Spider-Man.
I remember that from the Stan Lee documentary with great powers. Just oh god, it's just delighted me to know him. But again, adds a little bit of a kind of a sad context to it there. Poor Steve Ditko. He never spoke up for himself. So it's an unsolved mystery why he left, but he went to greener pastures. Tiki, where'd he go?
To DC.
Yes. I guess you want to be semantical, Charlton.
I'm sorry, man. It's no fault of you. It's obviously no fault of Steve Ditko, but I'm really running out of gas, man. We need to find some way to, like, I'm literally laying here falling asleep a little bit.
Can you pep up a little with something?
No, I can't. That's the thing. I need to go grocery shopping. That's the unfortunate thing of the situation. Usually, folks, I have caffeine at hand.
All right, okay, fine. The DC stuff's going to go by fast, so let me beeline it here. Okay, so essentially, folks, if you want to be semantical, you'll notice in the search of Steve Ditko, Alan Moore was featured on there, as we had mentioned, and fascinatingly, Steve Ditko was responsible for Watchmen. I kid you not. In that, see, originally Alan Moore, when he was doing Watchmen, Alan Moore is a lifelong Steve Ditko fan. He loves how in Steve Ditko's artwork, it really you captured.
Alan Moore is basically like Alan Moore. When we think Alan Moore, we think of like the crazy, like, caveman-esque, like weird occultist guy. But Alan Moore in this documentary is basically just a dorky fanboy in the best and most endearing of ways.
It is kind of adorably refreshing with Alan Moore. It's like, oh man, look at him. He's so passionate. He's not all despondent and
like, oh man, it's like Alan Moore. I wish you were like this cool currently.
Yeah, I guess League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the movie broke him.
Oh man, we don't talk about that.
Okay,
it's funny because I used to like that movie as a kid, just because like I know who these characters are because I read books.
Right.
Anyways,
the point is, so Alan Moore, he's a fan of Ditko, and again, one of the inspirations for kind of how we communicated Watchmen was, you can see the sense of panic and tension in a character in a Steve Ditko character. And he kind of brought that to all the frames of Watchmen, how we kind of follow a character in and outside of the mask. And the main, and what I'm getting at here is that originally Watchmen was going to use established characters from Charlton Comics. What was happening is that these Charlton Comics characters eventually they were bought by DC Comics. Therefore, DC had plans for these characters. So all these characters that the three I'm about to go through, they were created by either or in their entirety by Steve Ditko. And so it's so funny. Like I'm basically connect the dots here, like how we get.
I knew about. I knew that Watchmen was a take on older, more obscure characters. I did not know that all of them were made by Ditko, though. That's interesting.
Not at least more than a little more than half of them were, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we have let's see. So in '65 you get Captain Atom, which essentially is Dr. Manhattan, the man comprised of energy, of atomic energy, Captain Atom. You have 1966. You get Ted Kord, the Blue Beetle, and this guy, the character really took off because people love Blue Beetle. They love the modern Blue Beetle most, but this guy was the middle one. So he didn't create the character period, but he created like the Ted Kord version, which essentially was a friendly Batman. That's essentially what the Blue Beetle was. He was Batman with like an Egyptian beetle gimmick, but he was a nice guy. He was all smiles and like, hey. His parents. I don't think his parents were murdered, but he was still he was sunshine and rainbows, and this was the inspiration for Night Owl, just kind of a non-angsty Batman.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I mean, angsty in a negative way. I'd never say that. I would never insult Batman in any such way. But
no parents.
Leave that to the Lego Batman movie. So, and now 67 is the big one, folks. 67 is The Question and other characters like Mr. A. So essentially, The Question and Mr. A.
The difference between The Question and Mr. A? Is Mr. A just like a shorter running series or what? Because they seem very similar to each other.
Yeah, here's the thing. So The Question is an awesome character who, again, we bring back all the time, and he's a cult favorite of comic book characters with DC. Mr. Ray was a more obscure character. Mr. Ray was just kind of he was a part of like a series by something outside of DC. It was part of the I think there was a comic artist named Wally Wood. He had a comic series, and that's what Ditko was working on. So he created a character
by Mr. A though, because Mr. A just seems like he's like hardcore on the. He's like Mr. Rogers extreme. You know what I mean? He's like the Judge Dredd version of Mr. Rogers.
So essentially, what happened was these two characters they're somewhat similar, and they borrow from the Spirit inspiration that inspired Ditko in the first place. Again, like the Question looks like the Spirit, but minus a face. That's the Spirit. And Mr. A is like the similar detective gimmick, but he wears like a mask on his face. But again, it's like a detective gimmick, and together these guys fused together are the inspiration for Rorschach. You have the no face. Basically, he looks like he looks like the Question, but he has the morality of Mr. A essentially.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I feel like Mr. A is kind of like an examination of Ditko's own inner demons in a way, like the fact that he does have such staunch beliefs and such staunch political opinions, but at the same time, it's like he's grappling with that.
Yeah, and
like
folks,
he's grappling with kind of the moral ambiguity of. This is going to sound redundant, Dragon. He's grappling with the moral ambiguity of not having moral ambiguity.
Essentially, folks, all I can say is the philosophy. Steve Ditko, from what I've heard, he's a big advocate for the teachings of Ayn Rand, German. Ayn Rand, she was a German-Russian, a mixture of a German-Russian philosopher who believed primarily in objectivism. Now, folks, unfortunately, I don't know what it is, but unfortunately, you can't explain philosophy in like a quick what is objectivism way. It's a whole it's like a system of beliefs, pillars of beliefs. Just trust me, it's a little messy. I think the simplest way I can put it, just without getting into all the nitty gritty of it, the simplest way I can put it is you believe in absolutes and you're in service of an all-consuming goal, and that's what the Question is. The Question believes in there's one overarching conspiracy that all these other conspiracies it's like all these threads lead to one big conspiracy. Mm-hmm. And Mr. A is of the Rorschach belief of no absolutes, no compromise. And famously, Mr. A's gimmick was that he left a calling card like how Spider-Man leaves like the whole friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He leaves a calling card of a card that is like the left side is white and the right side is a black square. And it means like that's the whole that's where you get the black and white for Rorschach and Watchmen. It's the whole Alan Moore was so fascinated with this idea that it's all white and it's what you see the world in black and white. There is no gray. It's like perfectly two things. Hence the cards. That's the inspiration for Rorschach there. So again, I can talk about the question on Live Long Day. Tiki, you saw a bit of the question in the Batman Brave and the Bold meets Scooby Doo movie.
Yes, I did.
Just great character. I highly recommend you and just everybody else watch the question in the Justice League Unlimited series. He's
I
so
know that's
fan.
something I really wanted to get around to, except my work went really overtime tonight. So
Yeah, but just trust me, folks. I'm at that character again. You see, basically, it's so full circle, snake eating the tail there because the question inspired Rorschach, and the question in JLU is kind of inspired by Rorschach, just not a murderer. So it's kind of interesting.
God.
So again, very interesting. Like Ditko's stamp on a detective character with a really great interest. Again, it has the Ditko gimmick of like guy without a face. How interesting is that? And again, honestly, Ditko became this guy, like a mysterious guy. Again, the artist without a face. That's kind of what Ditko is in many respects.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see. Again, just to wrap up on DC here, and then we'll just basically by the end here. Okay, then 68 we get Hawk and Dove. Now, Hawk and Dove essentially was the political debate side of Steve Ditko, where it was inspired by the Vietnam conflict. These were like two characters who, honestly, I wasn't crazy about Hawk and Dove because they were kind of boring to me. They still are kind of boring to me because they're all political debate and there's kind of like not really memorable heroes. They're just like
it seems like the type of book where it's like, okay, why at this point, why even go for the pretense of putting on the costumes?
that's what I'm saying because that's literally like they're just like going they put them in like an episode or two of Just League Unlimited and
Oh,
it was
really?
like, and that's the thing, it was like a whole thing of like they're having a debate and then Wonder Woman comes in to spice up the episode because like yeah it's just gonna be these two guys like having a debate and bickering with each other the whole time. It's just not, but they're in like these ridiculous Hawk and Dove costumes. Like okay, what's the point? I don't get it. So so yeah, a little tricky for me in my younger years, but then we get okay, this one's important. I think this one's gonna blow your mind. So 68 also gives us the Creeper. The
Yes,
Creeper,
tell me about the Creeper.
the Creeper and the Question were all like and Mr. A. These are all like pure Steve Ditko. Like it was all him. Like no other guy created them. Other artists and writers ran with them years later. But the whole origin, it was like it's like all Ditko, man. Like no co-creators, all Ditko. And with the Creeper was just kind of an insane anti-hero essentially. It was just kind of a reporter in Gotham who went crazy. He was chemically kind of tampered with, and that's why he has the yellow skin. He goes crazy and he laughs all the time. And what they did is in the New Adventures of Batman, the revamped animated series episode, they built this character Jack Ryder, the reporter, and they adapted the Creeper story. And they had this little like Ditko department store and everything. It's like a little fan service to the Steve Ditko years. And my point, Geeky, is, and this is what's going to blow your mind, is that this episode gave Bruce Timm the idea for when Spielberg came a knocking at Bruce Timm's door and asked him like, "Hey, I want to do a superhero show." They want to do a superhero show, and Paul Dini and Bruce Timm were kicking around some ideas, and they kind of landed on, "Hey, let's do a kind of a what if the Joker was an anti-hero?" And they went to basically something like when we did that Creeper episode, the episode with the Creeper, and that gave us Freakazoid. So Steve Ditko in part created Freakazoid.
Wow,
how great is that? I know, right? That's
I love that. That's so appropriate.
Without the Creeper, we don't have Freakazoid because again, that's like his Creeper was supposed to be kind of like an anti-hero that was supposed to be included on Batman, but they never got to it. And then when they're looking for like a hero for Steven Spielberg, well, we were toying around with it with the Creeper. Let's do something like that, and that's Freakazoid. Okay, so Steve Ditko kind of has a quiet return to Marvel. Didn't really make a big fuss, and I just bring these up in like two little bullet points here. Is that we get two characters from Ditko when he returns. In '88, is like years later. 1988, we get Speedball. Speedball, it's a very forgettable name, but here's the big.
No,
here's
that's
the.
not a forgettable name, Dragon. That's a very memorable name in the drug community.
All right, fine, but a forgettable superhero name, I should say. But here's why Speedball is important,
I don't even know what it is. I've just heard that terminology thrown around.
Speedball was kind of a vaguely forgettable character. He's part of this team called the New Warriors. Now, if the New Warriors rings any bells for you, that's because in the comics, the New Warriors were the superhero team, the careless superhero team that got all those people killed that created the Civil War conflict.
Ah, okay.
And Speedball, he had this really interesting arc of like he felt so bad for it, he became like an angsty character called Penance, and it was like he had like all these pins
Oh
in
man,
the
that sounds
costume.
emo as hell.
I know it's like that's like Deke. I don't like throwing the word emo around, but I absolutely agree. This character is 100%. He's such an emo character. And then we get Squirrel Girl, who just is a very niche, very popular character. She's really niche, and I hear like she and Speedball are going to be getting a show. Basically, going to add Squirrel Girl to the New Warriors team, and that was they run into some production troubles, but they're making a live action show out of it. So again, the work of Ditko, it's kind of making its returns. As Squirrel is a very popular character in her own right. She actually defeated Doctor Doom once.
Nice.
I think maybe twice, but she defeated her once. And the idea is that everyone underestimates Squirrel Girl, but it's like an Ant Man thing or like a Rocket Raccoon thing. It's such a ridiculous concept, but in practice, really, she's really dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I guess just in summation here, so the final days. So there's the final days. So
I mean,
basically,
yeah, just the fact that he died alone and was found years later or days later, yeah, that's heartbreaking, man. I gotta say that alone kind of adds an air of tragicness to the because when I first heard the news, I was like, it wasn't like I didn't like write it up. I didn't like brush it off my shoulder like, oh, I didn't know that guy was still alive. But that was kind of my reaction. I was like, oh, like, okay, well, I mean, it's very sad that he's passed. May he rest in peace. But this is someone who it's like we haven't heard anything from in like a decade.
yeah, and just speaking to that, the last again with this documentary, the last really we again the last like recorded and dated thing we know of Ditko is really this documentary and in the public eye, where this guy Jonathan Ross, who was a big Ditko fan, he did this little special for the BBC. He went on a path of like celebrating Ditko and eventually using Neil Gaiman, who again was friends with Ditko in real life, because again
Oh my
Ditko was
god,
a
Neil Gaiman is so freaking pleasant in this thing.
he is, and again, to you gotta check out Lucifer if you want more game and magic, man. It's
You know what's funny is that it just basically like reconfirms our silly little headcanon that Mr. Smiley from Steven Universe is Neil Gaiman.
I would like to think that, but the point is, Neil Gaiman said from what I understand, at least the way it's presented here is that from what I've heard, many accounts I've read in the passing of Steve Ditko, is that he was very approachable. That if you it's like a Bigfoot sighting, if you ran into him, like a Bill Murray sighting, more accurately, he'd be really nice and cordial, but like you'd never be able to find him again, sort of thing. Where it's he was he was so secluded towards the end. I mean, in the decades, where he just kind of isolated himself. He was in New York the whole time. He was secluded. He was out of the limelight during the big, superhero movie boom, during the big Spider-Man boom specifically. Like as superheroes are kind of their zenith of popularity, even before the true zenith, but even like in 2016, I imagine the case would still be the same, but even more so. He's keeping out of the limelight. I mean, he declines to be filmed for interviews. That's why you can only find this documentary is like the only time you're going to get something close to a Steve Ditko interview. I mean, I think there might be a few like text, like written interviews. That's probably the closest you're going to get to like a modern interview with the guy. But from what I hear and what we see in practice at the end of this thing off screen, is that he's nice to fans who find him, and people wrote him letters. Like he would respond back to the letters. I heard that it was even up to his 90s. That when he was getting to the age of 90, he would still write back to people. That's what I heard. I haven't heard that substantiated, but I heard that he was still writing people even to the day he passed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so sad to me he had to be found. I mean, I feel he deserved better, but by the same token, I mean, he was secluded and he wanted that, though. It's not like a Bill Finger thing where Bill
That's
Finger was
true.
like,
That's true.
it was a great injustice. But I mean, I can only hope that he went out on his own terms in just being secluded the way he was. Like, it's like he was a gleefully accepted Granite State form, like Walter White going into seclusion. But what if that was what he wanted? What if he just stayed there? That's kind of what we have with with the last days of Ditko. And I mean, folks, the fan art that we had before us here, something that's kind of happened upon today. And of course, this happens when we have a big passing. You're going to see a lot of really emotional fan art. And this, to me, this really reached me. This Doctor Strange and Spider-Man in the MCU, the way we kind of see these characters now, and what we know about Infinity War. And of course, both of these characters, something similar happens to them in Infinity War, let's say. So it makes this even more sad. And just seeing them kind of go off with the man who created them, kind of through kind of this portal to another dimension, something kind of psychedelic, something kind of trippy, very latent in Doctor Strange, but again with kind of the support of Spider-Man. Again, the two things that kind of shaped this guy's career and in Marvel and really put this guy on the map. The reason we know Ditko primarily are these two characters. I love all three of them are together. It's a really impactful image. We images like this all over the place with Ditko. I think it's really great. So yes, T, what are your final thoughts?
Oh God, man, I'm sorry. I'm
Home stretch. We're almost there.
Yeah, like you said, Dragon. I feel like this guy is kind of like he's the more upbeat version of the Bill Finger, where he didn't really live a tragic life. I'd like to think that I'd like to think that he lived a very reserved, very accomplished life. But at the end of the day, his work just kind of speaks for itself. It's not anything that's like, I don't know, I'm really struggling. I'm sorry. Like I said, folks, it's not the fault of the subject at hand here. Am I slurring, Dragon? Am I doing okay? Help me out here.
All right, would you like me to bring it home?
Yeah, please, please.
All right, so folks, today I was reading a statement. Stan Lee officially responded to the death of his longtime collaborator, and Stan Lee kind of had the perfect way to describe how I kind of felt about the passing. He's really struck me because when I saw Steve Ditko had passed away, when I had the initial gut reaction, no. And when I saw it, I was crestfallen. I kind of felt numb. Adam West took the wind out of my sails, and I was fathoming. I was like the Logan thing of I just couldn't speak while the guy was being buried.
Oh yeah,
In the case of Ditko, though, because again, I didn't know the guy personally. Again, he was so out of limelight, but the legacy of the guy. And it was just what Stan Lee specifically had this quote that just spoke to exactly what I was feeling, where he said, Steve Ditko's talent was indescribable. And just that word, indescribable, because that's exactly what I was feeling. Again, that numb, it is indescribable. It's hard to describe Steve Ditko because we don't really know the guy. Because, Ditko and Kirby, they were, these are born directors on the page. These are guys who, again, they directed the action sequence. The Spider-Man leaping around the room, the way he does, the bank scene in Spider-Man 2. That whole here's your change, all of that. That feels so Steve Ditko in the staging of that because Steve Ditko laid that out. I think Steve Ditko embodied a hero like Spider-Man, and he tapped into that in the art style with the iconic look, and that put Marvel on the map. Again, Spider-Man, for all intents and purposes, is kind of Marvel's Mickey Mouse. Even though it's kind of there were times where Iron Man became the main flavor of a few months, and then Wolverine, and then back to Spider-Man, and it's all relative. But at the end of the day, Spider-Man was the character. Fantastic Four was the main property before Spider-Man. It was Fantastic Four and the Incredible Hulk, and don't get me wrong, they were big. But Spider-Man is the one that really took off and really just kind of cared. When you think Stan Lee, you think Spider-Man. And when you think some of the best versions of Spider-Man, you think Steve Ditko. I'll give you an example. Spectacular Spider-Man. Many people will agree with me. The best version of Spider-Man animation. We'll see how the new animated movie does, but I'm saying this is going to be the one to beat. Spectacular Spider-Man is a modern love letter to the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko days, the early years of Spider-Man. It's him as a teenager, him coming across these villains for the first time. They're all the original. Many original villains. Again, it's a teenager with problems in over his head trying to balance life. It's what that Spider-Man was. And with Homecoming, we try to do the same thing. We try to kind of capture that Ditko Levi because it's good, because it's what started all. And no Ditko, no Doctor Strange. We don't have the MVP of Infinity War. He'd be gone. No Ditko. I guess what I'm saying here, folks, to round off, is that we owe so much to Steve Ditko. He birthed my favorite Marvel hero, Rebirth Spider-Man. It's so off. I feel so off with Ditko because he left us. He left us in a way. I mean, he left society in a way, and now he's gone. There's something off about that. I just feel like something's just unbalanced about that. Where just it's. I mean, like he was gone, but he wasn't gone, and it was like again, it's like what Tiki was speaking to. Again, you may have considered him dead because he kind of cut himself off to the world, and now that he's gone, just something feels off about that. I love to think I'd love to think, considering he still wrote letters and such, and I'd like to think he saw the MCU and he liked it. I have no way of knowing that for certain. No one really has any way of knowing that for certain. I'd like to think that he watched the films of the MCU and he liked it. And at the end of the day, he was sturdy. Steve Ditko with the sturdy foundation.
I'd like to think that he was a fan of the Doctor Strange material.
I know. At the very least, I hope that he liked that. That's the one I would. They thought about reaching out to him, but again, the whole kind of like Steve Ditko having gone in seclusion, they kind of feared like reaching out to him. In reality, they should have, because again, it sounds like he was very approachable. They didn't risk that, so it's I don't know. They wanted to invite him to the set, but they were unsure like how that would, if there would be like a messy situation with Marvel. So I would hope that he saw these movies on his own. That's my hope. But at the end of the day, he was sturdy, Steve Ditko. He was the sturdy foundation. I think Marvel at its most creative was the works of Steve Ditko. Your Doctor Strange is it's off the wall visuals that you never imagined in a million years. It's Spider-Man, like the hallmark of Marvel. That's Ditko. The most creative things about Marvel were founded on Steve Ditko. And the last thing I have to say is I wherever he is, wherever he is, and this might sound sappy, but I truly think this, and this is what I truly want for Steve Ditko. I just hope that wherever he is, wherever he's going, I just hope he's happy, because we never knew if this guy was happy. He seemed nice. He secluded himself. I just hope he's happy somewhere. He deserves to be happy. For all the happiness that he brought us, he deserves that. And I'm fingers crossed that he's happy somewhere.